They told Africa it was finally free. Flags were raised, national anthems were sung. Crowds celebrated in the streets. As colonial powers packed their bags and left, across the continent, a new era seemed to begin. But what if the independence Africa celebrated was only partial freedom? What if the system that controlled Africa never truly left? It only changed its form. This is the story many historians call the hidden side of African independence. To understand it, we have to go back to the late 1950s and early 1960s, a time when the winds of change were sweeping across the continent. Countries began breaking away from European colonial rule. In 1957 became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from Britain under the leadership of Nkrumah, famously declared that Ghana's independence would be meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of Africa, and soon many nations followed. Gained independence in 1960, in 1963 and 1962. After a brutal war against France, between 1957 and the mid-1970s, most of Africa officially became independent. But behind the celebrations, many African leaders began to realize something troubling. Political independence had arrived, but economic control had not disappeared. This is where the concept of neo-colonialism began to emerge. The term was strongly popularized by who warned that Africa risked entering a new form of control, where former colonial powers still dominated the continent's economy, resources, and political direction. In this new system, foreign influence didn't always arrive through soldiers or colonial governors. Instead, it came through financial institutions, multinational corporations, trade agreements, and political pressure. African countries exported raw materials, oil, cocoa, gold, diamonds, and minerals, often at low prices, but the finished products made from those resources were manufactured in foreign countries and sold back to Africa at much higher prices. This created a cycle where many African economies remained dependent on the same global powers that once ruled them. Another challenge came from the way colonial borders were drawn. During the European powers divided Africa with little regard for ethnic groups, languages, or historical kingdoms. When independence arrived decades later, these borders remained. This meant that many newly independent countries inherited deep internal divisions that sometimes led to conflict. Political instability soon followed in several regions. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union competed for influence across Africa. Superpower rivalry often turned African nations into strategic battlegrounds for global politics. One of the most tragic examples occurred shortly after independence in 1960. The country's first prime minister was overthrown and later assassinated amid international political tensions and internal power struggles. For many Africans, events like this raised questions about whether true sovereignty had been achieved. Even decades after independence, many African economies continued to rely heavily on exporting raw materials while importing manufactured goods. Foreign debt also became a major issue for many governments. International lenders often provided loans that helped fund development projects, but repayment obligations sometimes placed enormous pressure on national economies. Still, the story of African independence is not simply one of betrayal or failure despite enormous challenges. African nations have made significant progress. In many areas, cities have grown into major economic hubs. African entrepreneurs, artists, scientists, and innovators are reshaping the continent's global image. In recent years, new efforts toward economic cooperation have emerged, including the AND trade initiatives, designed to strengthen commerce between African countries themselves. Many economists argue that the next phase of African independence will depend on economic transformation, building industries within Africa, increasing regional trade, and gaining greater control over natural resources. The conversation about African independence continues today, because independence is not a single moment in history. It is a process, a journey that evolves over generations. The leaders of the 1960s fought to remove colonial rule. The leaders of today face a different challenge: building systems that allow Africa to thrive on its own terms. In a globalized world, so is African independence a scam? That question depends on how one defines freedom. For millions of Africans, independence ended an era of direct foreign rule and opened the door to self-determination. But for others, it revealed a deeper struggle: the fight to control Africa's wealth, resources, and future